I suppose we can move on to any questions.
Yeah, I'm going to ask the first question, Joe, to give people a chance to do some texting and to indicate. Just a reminder to people that if you're on a mobile phone, you will need to unmute yourself and *6 and then mute yourself again afterwards to ask your questions. But the first question I want to ask Joe is one specific to this programme, because you're probably aware that the timescales on this programme are incredibly truncated. So by March 2016, we have to have produced some sort of outcomes. So a lot of people listening, of whom there are 64 by the way, will be thinking, we don't have the time for all this prototyping. So are there strategies whereby you can run early implementation and prototyping in parallel?
Yes, absolutely, I think so. So there might be a number of core things that you might start to implement and a number of key things that you might start to prototype. So the example I gave about employment, that was a 2-week intensive period of prototyping. So in 2 weeks we moved 10 people, from those 10 people we got 6 people into work. So even in a small amount of time you can do that exploratory and developmental testing, but also using prototype just to test very specific interactions, perhaps some of those that you feel are slightly more higher risk than you would want to see in an early implementation. That can be a useful way of doing that, because you can de-risk those. You can create this sort of opportunity to do that safely, and you still have the opportunity to do some of that more innovative work at small scale while you're perhaps implementing some of those earlier ideas.
That's brilliant. And I suspect it might be linked actually, but we've got a text in from Julie Temperley, who you might know, asking, can we ask Joe whether there are any specific issues when dealing with vulnerable young people rather than adults? Are there any special considerations for their engagement in testing work?
So I think a useful frame that we often use when we're thinking about working with individuals through a prototyping or testing process is that they enroll in that process. So they give their consent to be part of this experimentation that we're doing. And we're very clear around the kind of bounds of that experimentation. So with young people, there are obviously some issues around guardianship. So ensuring that that consent sort of general practice is below 16, good practice is below 18, to ensure that there's consent from their guardians, their parents or guardians, in order for them to partake in this process. I think the key other part of that is to engage with a range of what we sometimes call gatekeepers. So organisations or professionals who have a strong relationship with those individuals, and using them as a way to ensure that we are kind of sense checking our activities, that if something goes wrong or if there are any concerns, that the individual participating is aware of who they might go to speak to, and there's an existing relationship there. And so in terms of the kind of vulnerable aspects, you can cover it through doing that. And that's exactly what we did with the mental health work, was had some very clearly identified gatekeepers for each of the individuals that we were working with, so that if there were any concerns, and that we could test some of our thinking with them.
Excellent. Well, I've got a question from Colin McGinn and a question from Lizzie Insel, who will come second, because I need to prepare her for the fact that we'll unmute everyone, and Lizzie, you will have to unmute yourself in order to contribute your question. But Colin's first, which is, what discipline, oh, this is a tough one, Joe, here you go. What discipline or body of knowledge are you basing this on?
That's a good question, Colin. It
is a good question.
Absolutely. So the discipline that my background is in service design, and for those of you who don't know what service design is, you're like most people. It's quite a young discipline, and it's a discipline that draws on lots of different other disciplines. So some of the kind of body of knowledge that I've generated is through working in multidisciplinary teams as a service designer, so working with sociologists and anthropologists, but it's really corely around service design as a discipline that's been mainly used within the private sector, and this idea of prototyping really came from the product design industry. So the idea of testing things in small scale, be that cardboard or paper, before you go and make 20 million mobile phones, you prototype those, and a lot of that discipline has been drawn from that.
Okay. So would it stand up to a kind of academic scrutiny, Joe?
Well, there are different frames of this experimentation and testing that you can use. So there is a frame where you can focus it more on in the academic context, and where you might want to do it more intensively. You might want to ensure that some of the rigor that would be necessary within that academic context was there. Or there's the frame where you don't do it in any form of academic context, and you just do it as a learning process. And actually, a combination of the frames can be very useful. And some of that early prototyping, when you're testing in low resolution and just an exploratory testing process, what you could be just doing there is generating qualitative evidence around what some of the solutions might be. And as you move forward into higher resolution, you might want to build in some more rigor in order to generate some of that more quantitative evidence that you might require.
Okay, thanks. Lizzie, are you going to... Okay, Lizzie, do you have your question? Star 6.
Hello.
No. I'll give...
Apologies. I think I should have typed my question rather than spoken it. And still worse, you started to answer it, Joe, in the response you've just given. But I was going to ask around when you're doing testing of this type, what kind of evidence base you're looking to develop. So you talked about doing some role plays where you'd work through those processes, but depending on the services that you're delivering, what kind of metrics or measurement might you use to kind of test the validity of, or to establish the validity of what you're prototyping?
Yeah, so I do think it's a good question, because I think it very much varies depending on, in a sense, the purpose of the testing process that you're going through. So in some of that early exploratory testing, some of the metrics that you need to use can be kind of quite wide, and actually it's more about that convening that learning forum, so that you're working with a range of different stakeholders, significant stakeholders that you have, for them to draw the learning and triangulate that learning, perhaps with a wider evidence base, in order to build the case for it. I think as you move forward, I think there's something around breaking down the journey of a service or a solution into its component parts, and trying to build an evidence base against each of those, for both against the outcome at each moment that you're trying to generate, but also some of the kind of experience data that you might be getting in terms of how people are experiencing that service, whether it's a positive experience, whether they're going to continue to engage with that experience. So I think it's very broad and very wide.
Thank you very much. Does that satisfy you, Lizzie?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, we have Richard Hakin from Brighton and Hove, who has a question. And who will need to unmute himself to ask it. Richard, are you there? Star 6? No, okay. And Matthew Horn's texted to say, could we repeat what Lizzie's question was? He's got the answer, but he hasn't got the question, which was about the validation of outcomes from the prototyping work. Richard has now typed his question. Thanks, Richard. Do you need a team of different disciplines to implement prototyping and testing in this way? For example, researchers, data handling, staff, etc. And so is this normally over and above the resources that a local authority might have in its frontline team?
So again, I think that's a good question, and I think it really depends on what you're testing. But I would generally say no, because I've for example, the prototyping in Lambeth that I described, there was very light touch bit of support from myself in order to support that, but actually by convening the right learning forum that had that range of clinicians to GPs, etc., there was a lot of that those skills in the room and some of those an understanding of what we need to pay attention to throughout that process. And so there was very light touch support to deliver that intensive 12-week prototype that was required. And actually it was just pulling together a team and ensuring that they had the space to engage within the prototype, rather than bringing in any specialist disciplines to support the process. However, depending on the situation and the context in which you're prototyping, it can be sometimes obviously useful to draw in some of that extra support if you can.
Okay. John Lakin, thank you for your question, John. What are the implications for this type of design to how the projects are evaluated? In other words, will a standard green book style evaluation work? Do you know what a green book style evaluation is, Joe? Because I don't.
No, I don't.
But yeah, go on, have a go at answering it nonetheless.
In terms of the first question around the kind of implications for the evaluation, it's around the business case that you need to generate. Okay, I'm being told it's around the business case.
Yeah, I'm being told that as well, Joe. It just shows how much we know about the real world.
Exactly, the cleverer people. So, to some degree, I've seen it being used in business cases in a range of different ways. Some is to generate some of that quantitative evidence, those experiential evidence, through doing this kind of process, in order to describe what good looks like, in order to describe an evidence base around the appetite from users to engage with this type of service. So it's often used in those types of bounds. I think moreoverly, it's used because it's part of a generative process. In terms of building a broader business case around it, I would certainly suggest that part of that stepped process of development is to look at using some of this exploratory and model prototyping processes as part of a process of prototyping with a smaller group of people, and then moving on to piloting in order to build the business case. Because the best you're going to do in terms of generating evidence is to generate evidence that perhaps through triangulation with other forms of evidence, you might be able to support your business case, but it's not going to give you a complete understanding of the kind of value and outcomes that you might require for a wider business case.
Okay, thanks, Joe. I think we have, if anybody has it, we have time for one more question. If you want to ask it direct, you can unmute yourself, *6, and ask your question. Okay, if nobody's coming in, Joe, I will ask you the one that I was going to ask at the beginning, which is, you mentioned, just by way of passing, ethnographic research. How much is that a part of your work? How often do you use it? In what ways do you use it?
So yes, it's a big part of work. So I think one of the significant ways of thinking about ethnographic research, which for those of you who don't know what ethnographic research is, it's the process of research through kind of open conversations that are often delivered within a participant's environment and context, so within their home or within their community, and it's often an intensive process that's spending time with an individual, sometimes between a day to 2 days of time, from 12 to 24 hours of time with an individual to really begin to understand things from their perspective. Now, if we think about ethnographic research in our frame around testing, I think what's really interesting about ethnographic research is there's an opportunity to have conversations with people to understand what good looks like from their perspective, and for them to lead you and guide you through experiences that describe good for them. That can be really useful for helping you to generate and develop solutions. A good example jumps to mind of working with a young lady looking at issues around criminal justice and how we might better support her while she was in probation, and spending time walking around Iceland with her and her describing the experience of the positive experience that she had with Iceland as a company, and being able to have a conversation around how some of those principles of that positive experience might be applied to her probationary services, which was a really different frame than I'd have ever been able to look at the problem from, but was actually elicited some fantastic insights into what might work for her and what some of the kind of core qualities of a relationship might be that would really enable her to kind of effectively use that support. So it's something that's a big part of that work, and it's something that can be used in a process of exploring solutions as well as developing an understanding of the broader challenges and experiences of individuals.
Thanks, Joe. That's brilliant.